So, today we're going to dive into something incredibly intense. We're going to look at the raw, human experience of what it's like to be an American detained in China. We're putting the high level politics aside for a moment to really understand the day to day reality on the inside. I want you to really think about this question. What is a day in a Chinese prison actually like for an American, especially when you can't speak a word of the language? Imagine being trapped in a system where you can't read the rules, you can't understand the orders, and you can't even ask for help. This isn't just some inconvenience, it's the central fact that defines every single moment of your existence. If you look at the official numbers from the US State Department, they say only a handful of cases are wrongfully detained. But human rights organizations, they paint a very, very different picture. They estimate that over 200 Americans are currently being held in China, many under what are called coercive measures, things like exit bans or just arbitrary detention. And every single one of them is living some version of the day we're about to walk through. So, let's get into it. The daily grind. Life inside is governed by a routine that is engineered for one purpose and one purpose only: to break the human spirit. It is a relentless cycle of physical labor and absolute psychological control. Okay, just look at this schedule. It is absolutely relentless. The day starts with a blaring siren at 6:30 a.m., not for breakfast, but for mandatory political indoctrination. You're reciting prison rules or singing patriotic songs. Then it's straight to forced labor. A quick break for a meager lunch, think watery rice and maybe some pickled vegetables, and then it's right back to work for another 8, 10, sometimes even 12 hours. And that 10 p.m. lights out, it's often just a formality. The cell lights can and do stay on all night long. So what is this forced labor, you ask? Well, former prisoners describe assembling products that often end up right back in Western markets, things like Christmas lights, gift bags, packaging for big-name brands. And they're facing these impossible quotas. One account mentions having to assemble 6,000 lights a day. Can you even picture that? And if you fail? Well, failure could mean a beating, or it could mean watching your already tiny food ration get cut in half. And the living conditions, they're just as brutal. We're talking about cells that might be designed for 10 people, holding up to 30. Everyone's sleeping shoulder to shoulder on a concrete floor or a bare wooden platform. Privacy, forget about it. There's an open squat toilet in full view of every cellmate and the surveillance cameras. Food isn't just about survival here. It's one of the primary instruments of control. The ultimate goal of all this was summed up perfectly by a former American prisoner named Stuart Foster. He called the entire system a soul-crushing monotony. It's not about rehabilitation. It's about grinding you down to extract total, unquestioning compliance. Now, imagine you take all that physical hardship and misery, and you layer something else on top, an invisible but completely impenetrable wall, the wall of silence. For anyone who doesn't speak Chinese, the language barrier itself becomes a constant, grinding form of psychological torture. This is where it gets really terrifying. Look at this comparison. A simple, vital request like, "I feel sick, I need a doctor," becomes this desperate, frantic game of charades that gets you nowhere. Not understanding a shouted order from a guard isn't seen as a language issue, it's seen as defiance, and that can get you punished. You can't report abuse, you can't defend yourself, you can't even ask for a blanket when you're cold. You are utterly and dangerously alone. So you can imagine the mental toll this takes. It's catastrophic. It creates this constant state of fear and confusion. This complete isolation is so profound that some former prisoners have compared it to sensory deprivation torture. It leads to severe depression, withdrawal, and a much higher risk of self-harm. You basically just retreat into yourself because it's the only way to survive. And this vulnerability, this inability to communicate, it gets even more acute when you're talking about your health. Because in this system, medical care isn't just inadequate or broken, it's actively weaponized. Systemic neglect becomes a strategic tool, and it has absolutely devastating consequences. You can see the devastating human cost in real-world cases like Nelson Wells Jr. and Dawn Michelle Hunt. Both have been imprisoned for over a decade. A decade. Nelson, who had a pre-existing head injury, has seen his epileptic seizures get worse and worse, and he's lost over 100 pounds. Dawn is suffering from conditions that may require a hysterectomy, but she has zero trust in the medical care being offered by the very system that's holding her captive. So you have to understand this isn't just about an underfunded system or some kind of incompetence. Allowing a prisoner's health to decline to a crisis point creates extreme desperation. And that desperation, well, that's something that can be leveraged. And that is exactly where we have to zoom out, from the individual's daily life to the chilling geopolitical reality. Because these Americans are not just prisoners, they are pawns in a much, much larger game. There's a term for this. It's called hostage diplomacy. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the practice of using people, their health, their freedom, their very lives, as leverage to achieve political goals. Their guilt or innocence becomes completely irrelevant. Their only value is as a bargaining chip. And if you look at the Americans who have been released recently, a really disturbing pattern starts to show up. Take a look at this. What do you see? They are often older, they've been detained for years, and they are facing a severe health crisis. Kylie, for example, suffered a stroke while in prison. Their release doesn't come from a court of law. It comes from a high-stakes deal made behind closed doors. And let's be crystal clear about this. This isn't speculation. The release of John Liu and Kylie was part of a prisoner swap. Their freedom was literally traded in a direct quid pro deal. This is the clearest evidence you can find that their detention was political, their value was strategic, and their release was purely transactional. So to bring it all together, what we see is this awful, compounded suffering. It starts with the daily physical brutality of life in prison. That is then amplified by the psychological torture of total linguistic isolation. That, in turn, is weaponized through systemic medical neglect, all while being framed by a geopolitical game where human life are the currency. And that leaves us with a final, really unsettling question. When an individual citizen becomes a pawn trapped between the machinations of global powers, what is the actual price of their freedom? Not just for them, but for the very idea of justice itself.